The Frank Olson family has lived here in Frederick, Maryland since 1950. Olson was a top-level biochemist at nearby Fort Detrick. In 1953, November, Alice Olson was told simply that her husband had fallen or jumped out of a 10th-story window at the Statler Hilton Hotel in New York City.
My own reaction was one of tremendous relief and very deep sorrow, and a sort of frustrating feeling that it had been so pointless, that human life had gone for no reason. But the grief was overwhelming, almost to the extent it was the night of his death.
One is either asked to believe that in addition to being malicious in many ways, the CIA is very bumbling. But in this case, I think there's another possibility that there may have been some intent. And I'd like to be reassured that there was no intent to kill my father. I think that is an open question.
Welcome you all, and express our thanks as a family that you all came today. We decided to have this at our home because we felt we'd be more comfortable speaking on our own ground, and I know that's made it a little difficult for all of you, but this is the place we wanted to speak from. Fort Detrick, where my father worked, is just beyond the trees. If there weren't leaves on the trees, you could see Fort Detrick down below. I want to introduce my family to you. This is my mother, Alice Olson. This is my brother, Nils Olson, my sister, Lisa Olson Hayward, and I'm Eric Olson. This is obviously a very significant moment in our lives, not only because we usually don't have this kind of an entourage in the front yard. This has been something that we've lived with as a kind of shrouded mystery, the question of how my father died for 22 years. And by reading the statement which we have prepared, each of us will read a portion of it. My mother will begin and read the first 3.5 pages, and then my brother will read from pages 4 till 6. My sister will read pages 6 and 7, and I will read the rest. And then we will answer questions. I'd like to emphasize at the beginning that there are many things that we still don't know about the events surrounding my father's death, many because we weren't told at the time and haven't yet been told, and many because it was so long ago. And there may also be some things I'm sure you'll understand that will be painful and we may not want to discuss today. After today, we've decided we're not going to be available for interviews and press conferences and so on. The statement will be available, and we wanted to make today the day to tell our story to all of our friends, to my father's friends and his colleagues, and to the rest of the country.
We are the family of Frank R. Olson. Frank Olson, a civilian biochemist working for the United States Army, died shortly after midnight on November 28, 1953, when he plunged to his death from a window from the 10th floor of the Hotel Statler in New York. The death certificate states that Frank Olson jumped or fell, and cites multiple fracture, shock, and hemorrhage as the causes of death. An employee of the Central Intelligence Agency has been with Frank in his hotel the night he died. This man was accompanying my husband when he was taken to New York to consult a psychiatrist.
Do you have any side effects since
Yes.
the test took place, and what have they been?
Well, quite a bit, because I had to quit school. I was hospitalized when I had the LSD experience, but that wasn't the end of it. I had to go through 6.5 months of psychotherapy. I was referred to a psychiatrist the next week, and That was very expensive for a student. And to add insult to injury, I received a hospital bill after I was admitted.
Do what?
I received a hospital bill for the treatment of me under the LSD, which I promptly sent to Marazzi. After that point, I've never seen or heard of him again.
Did you ever want to go back to there?
Senator Kennedy, I have a two-page prepared statement, if I may give it to you, and then you can ask me anything you'd like. 1953, my father, Harold Blower, died. At the time, his family was told that he died after receiving an overdose of a drug being given to him for diagnostic and/or therapeutic purposes. Now, the Department of Army has informed me that my father was a victim of a drug test program administered by the New York State Psychiatric Institute under an Army contract. The Army has supplied me with some of the file describing these experiments, which I believe you have. The description of my father's participation in this program is something I still find difficult to believe, much less understand. Not only is there no record of permission from my father to administer experimental drugs, but they were apparently forced upon him. I quote from the record, "First day, first injection, first comment. Very apprehensive, considerable persuasion required." Anyone who's been around mental institutions can tell you that means my father was tied or held down. And prior to the third injection, my father pleaded, "Why do you do this? I have plans to go home tomorrow." It's an outrage that this type of experiment has been permitted. There must be no more secret contracts to conduct experiments on innocent people. I cannot begin to express the dismay, fear, anger, pain that I feel, but I would like to make the strongest plea that I can that all those within range of my voice start to work with the philosophy that the best way to prevent this kind of horror, whether misuse of experimental or even everyday drugs, is to encourage people to believe that they are responsible for their own bodies. In order for people to be capable of making intelligent...
Well, I'm not sure when it started. Are you talking about...
Stop. When did it halt?
Well, are we talking about psychotropic drugs or psychomimetic drugs?
All right. Any kind of drugs that are used in any behavioral research or experimentation.
Secretary of the Army suspended all testing in the Army in July of 1975, pending the IG investigation.
I'm sorry, I was...
Pardon me. Secretary of the Army suspended all testing in July of 1975, pending the Department of the Army investigation.
All right. Now, can you tell us at the time? You certainly may. We'll put it in the record.
Instead of the one that permitted everybody to pass the buck and say, no, they didn't do it.
Senator Schweiker, I greatly appreciate that. I would, however, like for you all to
describable of where I have contemplated taking my own life.
Did you ever have those prior to the time that you took this this drug, or?
No, sir. I can honestly state I had never had any experiences such as this.
decisions about their health care, they have to have adequate information available. One step that could be taken immediately would be to encourage the use of 3 easily understandable, obtainable, and inexpensive books. They are simply a medical dictionary, a Merck manual, and a physician's desk reference. It's as easy to use a medical dictionary as an English dictionary. A Merck manual is kind of a grown-up's Dr. Spock. With the help of a medical dictionary, it's not difficult to understand. The physician's desk reference is a compendium of package inserts for most of the ethical drugs sold today. A package insert is also by law included in every drug package shipped by its manufacturer. The package insert describes the drug, what it's made of, what sizes and forms it comes in, what it looks like, what it's to be used for, how it's to be used, when it's not to be used, and what the possible side effects are. For example, I know you, Senator Kennedy, have been concerned about the misuse of antibiotics. A patient looking for an antibiotic in the PDR and/or his ailment in the Merck manual will find that he should have a culture
and sensitivity tests before an antibiotic is prescribed. He will also learn that antibiotics do not kill viruses. If any of the correct procedures are not being followed, he will be able to ask effective questions that will help to prevent the development of problems. I firmly believe that mass information that he did, we were not aware at home that he was involved in anything like this. He was, as I was aware, he was to come home the next day after this injection.
Yeah. How old were you then?
13. My mother and father were divorced, and I'd lived with my father for the last 2 or 3 years alone, and I'd been very close to him. So he did come out of the hospital at Christmas, just after this quote I gave you, "Why do you do this to me? I'm going home tomorrow." He came out and spent, I think, 3 days with me in a kind of a resort hotel on Long Island for Christmas. Copy of that?
Yes. Could you tell us?
Incident occurred at a meeting in the vicinity of Deep Creek Lake in western Maryland. The purpose of the meeting was completely disassociated with the incident. The attendees at the meeting, aside from 2 CIA representatives, of whom I'm aware, with myself and 5 people in my division, which included Dr. Olson.
That was a
Disaster. I would guess I can only state that my reactions have been pretty well described by Mrs. Ray and Colonel Jordan. Perhaps, let's say to me, it was the most frightening experience I ever had or ever hoped to have. Perhaps this was complicated by the fact that I didn't know what was wrong with me. I suspect that Dr. Olson had the same feelings, although I don't want to put myself into his mind. And I suspect the other 2 gentlemen did also. As best I can recall, this took place on a Wednesday evening, a week before Thanksgiving in 1953. We went home to Frederick, Maryland, and on Friday afternoon.
He
informed me that he had decided to resign.
Be glad to hear.
Well, I think we want to emphasize that there are many areas involving this whole incident about which we know little or nothing. And one area is the whole trip to New York, what exactly the purpose of that trip was, what kind of treatment he received, if it was treatment, what the purpose of the consultation was with Dr. Abramson, who we now know from the CIA documents we received was in fact an allergist and had been practicing in that specialty. The concern that we've had has been that apparently my father did pose some kind of security risk after he was given the drug. And given that, what kind of precautions were going to be taken for his well-being? And we know very little about that. We do know that there was no medical professional available at the meeting where the drug itself was administered.
Okay.
Supplement Colonel Rutt's testimony in any way with respect to Dr. Olson's behavior when he came back from Deep Creek Lake?
Creek. He'd been gone for 3 days, and he came in very depressed, very quiet, and I sat at the table and said, it's a shame that the adults in this family don't communicate anymore, because it was so totally unlike him. And the weekend, he spoke very little, but he was concerned about a bad mistake. He had not done well at the meetings. People had laughed at him. And it was totally unlike the kind of person that he was. And I spent that weekend, I
Say
showed
there's a real change in
a real
personality.
change in personality, and it had distressed me forever because I tried to reason with him. I asked him if he'd ever broken security. Had he ever falsified data, which were the two things in science that were most important? Of course not. And I said, well, then this is ridiculous. You know, it can't be that bad. But there was no way to reason with him, and which is what I was trying to do. Of course, I had no idea that this was not a normal depression. It wasn't a normal kind of concern which he had. But it was not like him. It was the most unreal weekend I can ever remember.
The most unreal weekend.
Unreal. When he left on Monday morning to resign, because he just had, he'd done so badly at the meetings. And of course I accepted this as fact. And he walked out of the house and then called me about 10 o'clock in the morning and said he'd talked to Colonel Rouette and everything was fine. And that night his mood was ever so much better. So the next day when he walked into the house about 10 o'clock in the morning and told me that he had consented to have psychiatric care and that someone had wanted to accompany him home because he was afraid, they were afraid he might do me bodily harm, I suddenly had to sit down. It was, I couldn't comprehend what was happening.
Have you ever considered the possibility of psychiatric care before this weekend at Deep Creek Lake?
No, it was, I assumed, of course, I was talking to a rational person. And that was the first time when he said they thought that I might do you harm. It was the first time it dawned on me that this man was not rational. And then I asked if I could go to Washington and drove down with him, with Colonel Rouette, and took him to a building which I couldn't identify, which I assume was a CIA building, and that was the last I ever saw him. I talked to him on Friday night, just after Colonel Rouette had talked to him, and it was a fine discussion. Everything was, you know, we will see you tomorrow. It was not a goodbye. That was the one thing that consoled me, was that I knew this could not have been an intentional act because he did not call up to say goodbye. It was, I will see you tomorrow.
Forward-looking.
Yes.
Well, now, when did you know that he was going to New York?
When he came home on Tuesday morning, he said he had consented to have psychiatric treatment and he was going to New York to receive it.
He knew then it would be in New York.
Chairman, could I say one thing?
Certainly.
Something that has troubled me. I never recall having told Mrs. Olson anything that was flatly untrue. I did allow her to think things that were not true. I just would like to have that put on the record that I do regret it.
Well, that's a very honorable gesture. I'm sure it was.
Colonel Rouette is a very honorable man.
Thank you, sir.
It's very heard here today in terms of so naive to believe that we're going to be able to, with the passage of any kind of legislation, eliminate the ills of a society. But what we can do is, to the best extent that as legislators that we are able to do, is to set up the kinds of protections for our citizens, which I think, as all of this panel would understand, all of us here, and I think I speak without exception for the members of the Senate and Congress, feel that every American's entitled to. I want to just say that, reiterate what Senator Mathias and I think Senator Stafford and Senator Schweiker commented on, is that I hope that you'll feel that we can be of whatever help that we possibly can during this period. There's nothing that's going to be, that we're going to be able to do that's going to bring back the loss of a loved one. And there's many sense the kinds of damage that have been done is irreversible. But to the extent that that we can help and assist, I want you to feel that any of us, myself and the others, are all included, want to be of whatever help, assistance that we possibly can.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's been a particularly revealing morning of testimony. I think the chairman is to be thanked for having taken the leadership in scheduling this hearing and bringing this whole question to the kind of focus that it has come today.
Where is that? Yeah, let me see what was in the third panel. Where the Christ is the... I mean, I can't... Where the hell is the list of the third panel? I don't even know what's here.
Knowledge at all
of work being done in that area.
Well, is there any going on?
I am told that there is not any going on in the military departments.
There's no research in behavioral therapy going on now in the Defense Department?
Not that I'm aware of.
Well, would you know? Is it conceivable it could be going on without you being aware of it?
If the procedures included the use of investigational new drugs, it would, the regulations, the policy requires that our office know, and it has since 1964.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if it doesn't involve drugs.
Are you talking about
Well, it could be
test pilots or
electroshock therapy or behavioral.
We have no information at all of our defense involvement in electroshock.
Well, any other. I mean, I don't want to get tied up in words here. Any other kind of experimentation in terms of any behavioral therapy.
Manipulation, we have no information of defense support of that type of research.
There's no research then in terms of behavioral therapy that are taking place today upon any either members of the military or women or children or any other American citizens?
Not that I'm aware of. And it would have, should have been reported if it was.
All right. Now, when did it stop?
Compounds, antidotes related to agents that were under investigation, or were, pardon me, their protocols were being evaluated in the Human Use Review Office of in the Surgeon General's office to determine whether or not the protocols would be approved. And those have just been held by direction of the Secretary of the Army.
Well, let's get that in layman's language.
We published the first Army regulation covering the use of volunteers as subjects in research.
That was what year? That was what year?
1962, sir.
And what, since then, how many have been submitted?
Okay, this is take one of the close. The testimony given here means there will eventually be a change in the system of human medical experiments. After hearing the stories of fear, depression, and suicide, this... Okay, all right. Okay, this is take two of the close. The testimony given here means there will eventually be a change in the system of human medical experiments. After hearing the stories of fear, depression, and even suicide, the senators appear to be in agreement that they have an obligation to change the system to protect the rights of the patients, whether under government or civilian control. Frank Tomlinson, ABC News, Capitol Hill. All right, this is take three of the close. The testimony given here means there will eventually be a change in the Okay, keep it rolling. All right, this is...
The Rockefeller Commission's investigation of the CIA disclosed that the agency had conducted drug tests on unsuspecting participants, and one of them subsequently committed suicide. The victim's family, only now learning the details of the death, plans legal action. Leslie Stahl reports.
22 years ago, Frank Olson plunged to his death from the 10th floor of the Hotel Statler in New York. His family was told he'd committed suicide. It wasn't until June 11th this year that his family learned that, in fact, he'd unwittingly participated in a CIA drug experiment that resulted in his bizarre death. Apparently unbeknown to Olson, then a civilian biochemist with the Army, the CIA had dropped some LSD into his after-dinner liqueur. The Olson family's been struggling to understand the suicide. No one from the CIA ever stepped forward to tell them the truth.
My own reaction was one of tremendous relief and very deep sorrow, and a sort of frustrating feeling that it had been so pointless, that human life had gone for no reason.
And we suddenly learned that for 22 years we were lied to, led to believe that my father had a, quote, fatal nervous breakdown.
I'd like to be reassured that there was no intent to kill my father. I think that is an open question.
The Olsons plan to sue the CIA for several $1 million and to press for a full disclosure of the facts. One question still unanswered, for example, is why, if Frank Olson suffered such a dramatic reaction to LSD in 1953, why the CIA's drug experimental program continued for another 10 years. Leslie Stahl, CBS News, Old Braddock, Maryland.
Agency, CIA, what do you think? Double agents, bungling, an agency in search of a mission in this post-Cold War era. But there was a more innocent time when government agents were seen as heroes who would stop at nothing in their fight against communism. Members of one American family say the CIA went too far, and they say they've been trying to break through an iron curtain of lies. Russ Mitchell has been following this story. Russ?
Connie, Frank Olson was a government scientist, a suburban family man. Then one fateful evening, his life took a turn from science to what seemed like science fiction.
In the pre-dawn hours of November 28, 1953, I was awakened to be told that my father was dead. How did my father die? Sadly, I believe that we still don't know for sure, except that he died just outside the Statler Hotel in New York City.
41 years ago, Army scientist Frank Olson plunged to his death from this 10th-story hotel room to a cold Manhattan sidewalk. Eric Olson remembers that night. He was 9 years old.
What were you told? I was told that my father had fallen or jumped out of a window.
Your mother suspected that he did not commit suicide.
If suicide means a conscious, willful decision on the part of an individual to kill themselves, this was not something she thought my father had done or would have done.
It was inconceivable. Alice and Frank Olson were enjoying the good life, a comfortable home, a devoted family. Eric's brother Nils was 5. Sister Lisa was 7. It was a model household. But what the family never knew was that this loving father and husband was living in a world of secrets.
What was your father's job?
My father apparently was working on special systems for the delivery of bacteriological and chemical agents.
In other words, Frank Olson was a specialist on how you put the plague into an aerosol can and gave it to somebody clandestinely in the morning while they were shaving.
John Marks is an author who has written about United States covert operations during the Cold War and about Frank Olson.
Olson worked for the Department of the Army, but he worked in the part of the Army that was doing work for the CIA in the area of biological warfare.
Frank Olson embraced a mission like many good Americans during the 50s, to stop the Red Menace.
The only way we can be prepared is to do all that we can in the way of research.
Developing poisons to disable entire armies and to assassinate world leaders. It was all in a day's work at Fort Detrick, Maryland, where Olson had his lab. And if that doesn't sound sinister enough, Olson's colleagues, like the men in these pictures, were experimenting with a powerful new drug, LSD. The mission was mind control. The client was the Central Intelligence Agency.
What was the objective of the CIA's mind control experiments? The idea of this program was that you could find a drug or a substance or a technique that would make people do things against their will. So perhaps you could slip a drug to a Soviet diplomat who would then become your spy, or you could make a person even into a controlled assassin.
It sounded like fiction, but when Congress learned of the CIA's LSD experiments, lawmakers demanded the facts. In hearings during the mid-70s, representatives learned the CIA had conducted mind control experiments on hundreds of people for more than 2 decades. The project, codenamed MKUltra, read like a pulp novel, but with whole chapters missing. The CIA, claiming national security, had censored most of the information, except for one startling fact that would shatter the Olson family again.
June of 1975, the Washington Post printed this story which said that a suicide had been discovered to have resulted from the unwitting administration of a drug to a scientist in 1953.
The drug was LSD, and the scientist, sure enough, was Frank Olson.
Why would they want to drug your father?
They wanted to find out what would happen if you drugged a scientist. Would that scientist divulge secret information?
Truth serum?
Yes, using LSD as a kind of truth serum.
Using Frank Olson as its unsuspecting guinea pig, the CIA got its answer. Olson suffered what is known as a bad trip. He became extremely paranoid, agitated, and confused. CIA documents say Olson turned delusional and suffered feelings of persecution, guilt, and inadequacy, feelings which lasted for days.
I think my father was disoriented by the effect of the drug, and I think this opened up a kind of channel to some deep doubts that he was already having about his own work in bacteriological warfare, and maybe some doubts about some of his colleagues and the kind of ethical principles that they had.
CIA officials reportedly became nervous, so concerned for Olson's health that they took him to New York City for psychological treatment.
It wasn't for treatment, it was to assess what kind of risk they were undergoing by the fact that my father might blow the whistle on the work that they were doing.
He got more and more scared, more and more out of wits, at which point he jumped or somehow fell out of a hotel window in New York.
New York City police called it a suicide, a conclusion never questioned by the CIA or congressional investigators.
The dispute in the case comes over, at this point, over whether he jumped because he was having this horrible experience or whether he was pushed.
Top of the windowsill is 2.5 inches from the top of the radiator.
41 years after Olson's death,
There's no ledge on this window. He could not have...
investigators are finally asking.
We didn't see any cut marks and so on across his face. There was a significant laceration.
Was it suicide or murder? Trying to solve the mystery is James Starrs, a professor of law and forensic science at George Washington University. The Olson family has recruited Starrs to lead a team of investigators.
I think as of now, we have 6 or 7 different scientific disciplines all coordinating their efforts.
Working on this case?
On this project, yes. You know, we can list them from pathology to anthropology to geophysicists, all giving their services, I might say, gratis.
Why?
Because they're fascinated by the project.
Now, after we had the scene created, we went to recreate the fall.
Part of the team is Mike Selberg. He's a biomedical engineer at a company called Engineering Animation. True to the laws of physics, Selberg is turning hard data on distance, trajectory, velocity, and point of impact into a visual map, hopefully showing whether Olson jumped or was pushed.
Right here, Dr. Olson hits a wooden barrier.
Investigators are combining scientific data with the accounts of the few surviving eyewitnesses, like Armand Pastore.
Let me get a volunteer.
The former hotel manager was the first person to come to Frank Olson's aid.
Where were his arms?
His arm was over here. The other arm was broken with the bone sticking out. And his eyes were really staring at and trying to speak to me.
Okay.
But I couldn't hear anything.
What was the condition of the right arm?
Olson died just moments before an ambulance arrived. Frank Olson was not alone in his room that night. There was a man in the other bed, an agent for the CIA named Robert Lashbrook. New York City police found Lashbrook sitting in the room and questioned him for hours. After writing in their report that Lashbrook was uncooperative, police decided not to pursue it and let him go.
1022A, 1028, 1018A.
Okay.
Hotel manager Pastore has a chilling recollection about the man in the room that night. He says the hotel operator helped place a phone call from Olson's room minutes after Olson had gone through the window. The operator who overheard the conversation told Pastore the caller was a man who said, "Well, he's gone." The man at the other end responded, "That's too bad." Robert Lashbrook declined to speak with CBS News, but recently told the Washington Post he never made that phone call. But what he did tell to his CIA bosses in 1953 raises questions about what really happened. Initially, he wrote, "I was awakened by a loud noise. Dr. Olson had crashed through the closed window blind and the closed window." But then, to reporters in 1975, it was not the crashing window that woke him up, and the window shade was no longer closed.
I woke up, Lashbrook said. Frank wasn't there. I saw the window shade going around and around, and the window was broken.
There are specific questions on my side with respect to the scientific investigation I'm conducting.
Contradictions have spurred Professor Starrs to try to confront CIA scientists who he believes may be connected to Dr. Olson's death, like Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, director of the agency's secret LSD program.
From what you have been able to ascertain thus far, what do you think happened on the night of November 28th, 1953?
Well, we have two things to look at. On the one side, you have narrowly only the scientific evidence. On the other side, you have all of the evidence, all the circumstantial facts, both scientific and non-scientific. Those non-scientific facts certainly predominate, certainly on their own, are most suspicious.
Of foul play?
Of foul play.
Of the fact,
most suspicious.
of the suspicion that this man was killed?
Most suspicious.
A detailed autopsy report might have proved what really happened, but only a superficial examination was performed in 1953. So, with the Olson family's permission, this past summer, Professor Starrs exhumed the body of Frank Olson.
What was your first reaction when you saw the body?
Well, my first reaction was to say caramba, or hallelujah. It means that whatever could have been done in 1953 can be done today. Turned out we found a fully mummified person.
And emotionally, it was very satisfying, you know, from the standpoint of a 9-year-old boy who wanted to see his father's body one more time since he had simply vanished. That was a very important moment for me.
Forensic analysis of Frank Olson's remains is almost complete, but preliminary results have turned up surprising new evidence.
The autopsy in 1953 found multiple lacerations on his face and scalp. We looked at his remains, and there were no lacerations on his face or neck, none whatsoever.
With questions and contradictions mounting, Eric Olson has taken his battle to Capitol Hill.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for meeting with me.
Lobbying congressmen.
What we have are remnants of the cover-up within the CIA itself that began immediately after my father's death.
And testifying in committee.
Do you want the government to reopen the investigation into your father's death?
Yes, I would like that very much.
What do you want in the big picture? What would you like to see happen?
Well, I'd like to see Lashbrook and Gottlieb in jail.
They would say to that, you're an obsessed son.
Well, they can say whatever they like. I mean, but I think the record speaks for itself. When you look at the lives that their experiments ruined, and when you look at the lack of any follow-up or follow-through in terms of concern for the people whom they drugged, I think then we can start to talk about who was obsessed.
You think your father was killed by the CIA?
That's what I think, yes.
Connie, the CIA continues to say that Olson's death was a suicide. The agency refused our request for an interview, but it did say it did cooperate with investigations in the 70s, and it will cooperate once again if the Olson case is reopened. By the way, Professor Starr's information, his findings, will be made public on November 28th. That will be exactly 41 years after the death of Frank Olson.
Thanks, Russ. Sure.